While swinging by Mary Jane's apartment, Spider-Man is shocked to discover a woman has been murdered in the streets below. Peter can tell from Mary Jane's shocked expression looking out of the window at the gruesome scene below her that she witnessed the murder, and if his spider sense is any indication, if the killer finds out about this, she could be in great danger. Taking off his costume, Peter goes and approaches Mary Jane. She's been doing a lot to take care of him since Gwen's death not too long ago, and now he wants to help take care of her too. Mary Jane is clearly traumatized from witnessing the event, and Peter encourages her to report what she saw to the police. When she refuses, Peter opts for a tactic of tough love, storming out and saying he won't have anything to do with someone who won't help with the police investigation. Peter knows this treatment is harsh, but he hopes it'll be enough to spurn her into action out of spite. He may have just lost yet another friend in all of this, but he believes it'll be worth it if it ultimately saves her life. With nothing else he can do on that front, he decides to investigate the murder himself. As he heads towards the scene, he is almost immediately attacked by the Vulture, and the two begin a tussle in mid-air. It doesn't take long for Spider-Man to deduce that the Vulture must have had something to do with the murder of this poor woman. But the Vulture is able to knock Spider-Man out as he crashes into the streets below. While the villain escapes, Peter recovers and decides that he won't be able to do anything else about this matter now, especially as the police close in on the murder scene. Instead, he decides to meet up with the Human Torch, as the two have been working hard to complete a new vehicle, something that he has regretfully named the Spider-Mobile. The two work throughout the night at the car, building it and improving it according to the specs they sold to a company in regards to this fantastic new vehicle. In the morning, Peter takes off and heads home. There, his roommate Harry Osborn is frustrated at Peter after the death of Harry's father. Harry blames Spider-Man for Norman's death, and when Peter refuses to acknowledge that Spider-Man had a role in the death of his father, Harry started to distance himself more and more from Peter. When Peter tries to reconcile with him, Harry angrily declares that they're not friends, never have been, and all they are now is roommates. Peter later goes to Empire State Campus for school, and he finds Mary Jane there. He tries to apologize, but Mary Jane insists she was just making a joke last night, that she didn't really witness a murder, and it was all just some goof. Peter sees right through this lie, but before they can get into this any further, Flash Thompson pulls up in a car he's borrowed from his cousin. He offers his two friends a ride. The Vulture flies in and grabs Mary Jane, capturing her now that he's discovered she witnessed his murder from last night. Panicking at this, Flash crashes his cousin's car into a post, knocking the man out, though to Peter's relief, his former bully is uninjured and just fine. Peter uses this opportunity to take off and don the outfit of Spider-Man, but he is stopped by Professor Warren, who points out that Peter's grades are slipping. Peter's professor is annoyed, but that only becomes worse when Peter insists that he can't talk right now and takes off. Ruefully, he thinks to himself that's yet another class he's just doomed himself to fail, making it 2 this semester alone. He had no trouble getting through high school with solid grades, but now that he's in college, things just aren't going well. Nevertheless, Peter really can't dwell on that matter any further as he catches up to the Vulture and Mary Jane. When the Vulture sees Spider-Man chasing after him, he drops Mary Jane, which causes Peter to panic. Instantly, he flashes back to Gwen's death. Fortunately, he's able to grab Mary Jane and return her to the ground unharmed. But the effect on Peter is clearly visible as he even refers to Mary Jane as Gwen. Peter becomes angry, saying that he's not going to let the Vulture hurt anyone else. He's not going to let what happened to Gwen happen to Mary Jane, and even if it means the Vulture's death, he's going to make sure that he stops this criminal. It doesn't take long for Peter to find the Vulture, who has invaded a biology lab at Empire State Campus. And the hero and villain once again engage in battle, this time in the close quarters of a research lab. Peter notices for the first time that the Vulture appears to have grown claws, and his hands actually resemble those of a vulture's. Before, this villain had always simply been dressed up in a vulture suit that enabled him to fly. Now, he appears to be something else entirely. The two break out into the lab and the battle continues on campus grounds. Spider-Man is able to blind the vulture before the two of them are captured in a net by the police. Harry Osborn watches this unfold, delighted that Spider-Man might finally get justice for murdering his father. He swears that if the vulture doesn't handle Spider-Man, the Green Goblin will. At that moment, a still blind vulture is able to break free of the net, grabs Spider-Man, and takes off into the sky. Mary Jane is worried about Spider-Man, but Flash insists he'll be fine. After all, he has all of them rooting for the hero. Several hundred feet in the air, the vulture is able to remove the webbing that had blinded him, and realizes that he wasn't able to grab the woman he was targeting. Not Mary Jane, but instead the researcher named Christine. Annoyed with being tricked by the hero once again, the vulture decides to drop Spider-Man, letting the hero fall to his death. Peter realizes he's far too up in the sky to be able to snag a building with his webbing, and there's nothing to stop him from falling to his death. Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is my recap and review of The Amazing Spider-Man number 127. So we continue our random series of reviews concerning the character Mary Jane, this time diving headfirst into the Gerry Conway era of Spider-Man storytelling, one of the most famous and important runs of the Amazing Spider-Man series throughout its long-standing history, and a huge one in setting up Mary Jane as not only a love interest, but also the general story of how she came to be a part of Peter Parker's life, tragically informed by the events of Peter's former love interest, Gwen Stacy, whose death happened only a few issues from before this particular issue that we're talking about today. So the wound is still fresh, and the feelings of this death and the corresponding death to Norman Osborn, or at least apparent death of Norman Osborn, is heavily felt throughout this comic, in particular in the form of how Peter reacts to certain things such as Mary Jane's brush with death in this comic, and Harry Osborn's now very tense relationship with Peter Parker and outright hostility towards Spider-Man. That all sets the stage nicely for this issue, which deals with the apparent attack of the Vulture. And this is only part one of a two-parter. As we learn in part two, it's not actually Toombs who's the Vulture in this particular story, rather some imposter with a whole bunch of details revealed in issue 128. But we're going to be focusing on 127 right now, and it's a pretty good story overall. I'm not going to pretend this is one of Gerry Conway's best issues. There's little problems here and there. The writing, though it's going at a frantic pace in this issue, is pretty clear and well done. Ross Andrew, the artist, does a pretty great job at depicting Spider-Man and his ongoing adventures. And the inkers and letterers generally do a good job, though some of the panels I find a little confusing, especially when it comes to the lettering of this comic. At times it can be hard to tell who's talking, Spider-Man or the Vulture, and were it not for the fact that their dialogue is so distinct from each other, I'd have a real issue delineating the dialogue of certain panels. That's little things though. The overall comic's very good, it's just I was a little surprised because I know what to expect out of a Gerry Conway comic, and this is on the lower bound of his net average of Spider-Man comics. Which isn't really to say it's bad so much as it's just not as good as some of the better Conway comics I've read. That's kind of the point of this series though, is we're looking at not the best ofs of any particular era of Spider-Man, but random issues. We kind of hit a bit of random luck with the Stan Lee comic we ended up reviewing because that one is particularly good and stands out particularly well in Spider-Man history. It is on some of the best ofs in certain republished issues of Spider-Man. This one, though, I've heard less about, but it isn't really bad, it just isn't that remarkable in the overall Spider-Man canon. And yet that canon is so heavily felt here. It is there in more obvious ways, such as in how Peter deals with Gwen's death and reacts to Mary Jane being in danger in this issue, but there's more to it than that. There's so much going on in this comic page to page, plot lines being set up that'll be dealt with much later, such as Peter's ongoing struggles with Empire State University and his school life in that regard, while also dealing with the ongoing construction of the Spider-Mobile, which is sure to make a big splash in the Amazing Spider-Man series not long after this. Those sorts of things are fun in setting out the story and building up future events and dealing with past events that are having a huge effect on current Spider-Man canon, which they're doing a really good job of here. Because that serialization, though heavy in this comic, doesn't feel like it overburdens anything. I was very easily able to recap and read this comic in general and have a good sense of what's going on because it's all perfectly laid out even if you don't know the exact specifications of every little bit of the story here. I really like the status quo being presented here, with Peter still struggling with college life and the loss of a loved one really informing his actions as Spider-Man. We're at this point more into a Bronze Age sense of comic book storytelling, and things are even darker now. But it doesn't feel like the black suit Spider-Man on the verge of becoming a full-fledged aggro vigilante like we would see in later years. There's a fine line that Gerry Conway is able to write with this character, keeping things the brisk and somewhat cheerful Spider-Man that we know, but also recognizing the fact that he's had to deal with this death and it's weighing on his mind and how he acts around people. All of this stuff works in my eyes. I really liked this comic and would recommend it, mild criticisms that I do have of the issue aside. There's little problems, sure, problems that were probably present to a degree in the Stan Lee comic, but that Stan Lee comic's so tightly written I just enjoyed the ride and didn't even notice any such issues. Here it's a little more obvious, the comic's a little bit clunkier, and we're starting to feel the weight of the canon of Spider-Man. But that canon is fun. It's cool that Flash Thompson's already a friend of Peter's and has softened his overall behavior from his high school bully days. And we're only at 1973. It's amazing how much Spider-Man canon can change in just a few short years. That's a really admirable part of these early Spider-Man era comics. They essentially just plodded ahead in real time. And we haven't gotten into the relatively more stagnant and slow-moving Spider-Man comics as we will in more modern storylines going forward. That might sound pretty heavy-handed, or that I have no love for modern Spider-Man comics, which isn't true. I just love it more when they're moving the story forward like it's happening in this issue, and it's happened in other issues under other writers in the future, such as Straczynski, or even what's going on right now with Nick Spencer and his current take on Spider-Man. I feel like there's a much more of a sense of progress happening in the Spider-Man comics, like what happens here in number 127, and like what's going on right now with Nick Spencer's writing. It's not the same, but it can't be the same. You can't go back and you can't just repeat the same old story, but it's different and it's embracing more of Mary Jane's character. She's pretty good in here, but once again, her role and aspect of the story, though much bigger than the Spider-Man Unmasked story that we just did, is a little more heavy-handed, and she has this real interesting role. Her whole reaction to witnessing this murder and the psychology behind it, and her almost pathetically trying to play it off as a joke the next day with Peter, is a very interesting side of Mary Jane. And she hasn't been affected by Spider-Man in her life yet. She's quite a different person from what she will become, and I found her character work pretty interesting, and Peter's relationship with her pretty good too. Peter recognizes that Mary Jane was a huge part in helping him deal with Gwen's death and trying to some degree to move on from that. And in turn, he tries to help her pretty genuinely in this comic, even going so far as to hurting her in the attempt to kind of push her into doing the right thing, and in turn, doing what he feels will be most likely to protect her. And he outright says to himself that this might cost his friendship with MJ, but it'll be worth it if she's safe. That's one of the more mature things I've ever heard Peter Parker say or think to himself in Spider-Man history in general. And if no other reason, this comic's worth reading because of stuff like that. Stuff that happens a few times in this comic that's really memorable and really stood out as a strong character moment for Spider-Man and his relationship with Mary Jane. Next up is an interesting aspect of doing these random reviews, as we're going to be looking at a comic that was the only issue chosen out of all these reviews that doesn't feature the name Spider-Man in the title of the comic. I really don't know to what extent Mary Jane has a role in this particular comic, but I am curious to see what the end result will be just the same. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.